All right. Rebecca, Zama, thank you for being here. It's always awkward when there's either one or nobody else joining, and then I just sit and talk to myself. So I appreciate you guys being on.
Well, hopefully you're good company.
But the good thing, we can make this pretty short, and since it's sort of likely falling around lunchtime for folks, we can get some questions answered and then keep moving on with our day. So thank you guys. I'll run through the sort of broadest overview, given that we're coming into Unit 6 here, and then we'll likely just turn it directly over. If either of you have thoughts or questions or any specific pieces, either of what's upcoming or the storyboard and anything in the past, we can dive into it. And as usual, happy to also just workshop some things if you guys want to share something and we can actually work through it. We can do that too. Storyboards behind us, looking towards data and evaluation and assessment. That's what's coming here in Unit 6. Already some good discussion going on around just the ethics of data use, and there's no better time, I think, to dive into this sort of topic. There's so much going on right now, just globally. The announcement on Twitter that just got made, I don't know if folks saw that, but I was really happy to see Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, made a pretty big announcement that he was going to sort of ban public or political ads and sort of political targeted tweets through Twitter. So that's a whole nother story, but yeah, it just happened yesterday.
But a good start.
Yeah, I think democracy is in need of some big sort of statements and sort of statements like that and policy maneuvers like that. So we'll see. Anyway, so there's that discussion that folks have already dove into. That's really what's upcoming. That'll kind of close out this weekend on November 3rd, and then we'll dive into a similar peer review process around the evaluation plan, posting a draft on Thursday, which is the 7th, then offering feedback by Saturday, and then getting the final evaluation plan submitted by the 9th or by the 10th, Sunday. So try to dive in. The one thing I'll mention is because we've now been through a couple rounds of reviewing and peeking at projects, I would say two strategies: either approach a project for which you've become somewhat familiar and really try to offer sort of more targeted and nuanced feedback because you are more familiar, or alternatively, I think it's just good to get broader perspective on some of how the other projects are evolving. So also feel free to just dive into another project that you may not be familiar with and get a sense for how they're approaching evaluation. So, but similar process as far as the peer review goes. So that should be somewhat familiar as far as sort of the Thursday, Saturday, Sunday timing. I think the two things I'll mention around evaluation, now that we hopefully have a fairly good sense of how these solutions could ultimately come to life, this is our chance to say, okay, we've really got a good sense of what these solutions might ultimately look like. How will we know that if and when they were to get fully implemented and learners interacted with them, how would we know that we invested time wisely and that it was a useful endeavor to build these out? And that's where evaluation and assessment comes in. So basically that's the hope, is that we're building instruments and mechanisms to know that the solutions we ultimately built were effective and changed the behavior or skill or attitude, whatever we're working towards, that the solution ultimately did have that effect on the learners. So ton of strategies, many ways to do that, but the key there is to just ensure that there's alignment. Again, we've sort of hit on alignment a few times over the last few weeks, but ensuring that there is alignment between the strategies to assess back to the objectives that we're ultimately saying we're trying to meet. So and then obviously through the experience and some of the content, anything else that lives between those two should sort of be aligned as well. But that's just a good check, before you get too far down the path of really building out a lot of this plan for evaluation. Just have it in your mind. Is it aligning back to those objectives? I think that's a key there. The other thing I'll mention is any providing of sort of samples of instruments or tests or things that you're looking at utilizing as part of the evaluation. Any if it makes sense and if it's possible to provide a sample of what that might actually look like, as it'll probably live as an appendix in your full solution design document, but you could obviously just sort of submit it along with the evaluation plan. But think about that. Any sample usually is helpful to just get a sense of how you're visualizing how some of this, some of the evaluation will actually get deployed. So those are kind of just two things to think about. Alignment is big, and some sort of reference or sample to how you see the tools you'll utilize or the strategies that you'll implement to evaluate, giving a sample of that and just giving us a peek at what some of that might look like. So that's it for Unit 6. Really, after that, we really start to kind of wrap up, and we'll do some synthesis work. I'd say also along the way, just continue to refine the broader solution design document. So we should be sort of porting our storyboard as well as our evaluation plan into that broader document or website or experience, whatever, however you're building it out. Keep in mind that we're layering those pieces in and trying to create a single cohesive design package sort of towards the end, which we will. It'll be a little while, but we will get into just reflecting and then displaying some of that work in sort of late November, coming after the break. So just to keep on the radar that we are sort of wrapping up the last major component, but we should still be building these components back into the broader document. So I'm going to wrap up and shut up. And Rebecca or Zelma, if you guys have anything. Oh, I see. Am I making that up? Hold on. Sorry. I had my screen switched over. Yeah, Chris looks like, hold on. Whoop. There we go. Oh, and Kelly too joined. Cool. And Will, you guys trickled in as I was talking. Cool. So I'm going to turn it over. Anyone else on the call, if you have thoughts or questions around anything prior or Unit 6 and evaluation or assessment, or really anything looking ahead as well. My piece is sort of done. I'm going to turn it over to you guys with any questions or thoughts.
So I do have a kind of question. I've been sick all week, so I haven't been into the week's assignment for a while. I'm just recovering, but I did watch the video for the evaluation. The first video you posted, and it shows some ideas of how to make the formative and summative evaluation. So is that a good model to follow for our projects?
I'd say yes. There's nuance within those strategies, but I'd say taking the broadest stroke over evaluation, and I think this would apply, I'm trying to think, this would really apply to just about every project. There's a few that will probably take different approaches, but anyway, for almost every project, I think the strategy of formative, which is, that can come in a lot of different flavors, self-checks, reflections, just means of building towards assessment throughout the learning experience, and then those ultimately culminating into what is more of a summative assessment, which is, sort of as you're bringing a lot of that formative work towards a single, I don't like using the test analogy, because I think there's so many ways to evaluate that aren't necessarily just sort of our traditional, true, false, multiple choice sort of tests. But those can still be effective. But I think that's a strategy that's going to work across the board. And it's definitely one I think most could employ, which is some sort of formative work that may exist at the end of each module, or depending on, again, this is dependent upon the project, but then leading towards either a single or maybe one or two sort of broader summative assessments that really nail home. And the thing, obviously we're aligning to our individual and unique objectives, but with a broader summative, you can also look at aligning it to sort of your broader singular goal. So we all have sort of these broad overarching goals that our projects are sort of working towards as more of a vision. Sometimes it's helpful to look at that as a guide for that summative assessment, to say, if and when learners complete everything and take this sort of, whether it's a test or a writing project or an actual hands-on experience of some sort. Again, these assessments can come in any flavor, but to know that you'll have a good indication of having met that broader vision and goal through that single summative assessment. That's a good way to look at it. But again, it doesn't have to be. Certainly the key is to ensure that those objectives are sort of met and aligned. But sometimes with a summative, it's helpful also to just keep that broader goal in mind.
Yeah, perfect. Thank
All
you.
that is to say, yes. I think that sort of formative leading towards summative approach and strategy makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other thoughts or?
Well, I'm seeing the rubric for our evaluation plan, and there's a criteria says propose a plan to communicate findings from evaluation. Is that for our stakeholders, for our learners, for everybody?
I'm glad you asked this, because I just had a meeting last night, and we this came up as well. So clearly, it's worth talking about. I would say it could be either or both. The goal there is there's going to be some sort of feedback or data that comes out of these evaluation plans. I'd say, first of all, is there a mechanism to communicate that directly back to the learner? And often this comes in sort of automated sort of self-checks. Rubrics are actually a good example of that. Often, you'll, in the quizzes that you guys have been taking, there's feedback and communication built directly into that assessment. So that's one. You may choose that it's helpful for the learners to get to have a communication channel where they're understanding where they're either succeeding or potentially falling short in meeting an objective that assessment is meant to address. So that's step one. But then, yes, definitely, there's another element that I think everybody should touch on, which is, an evaluation and an assessment plan is meant with the intention of being able to refine and improve the sort of solution or experience in some way. So do you have a strategy to communicate those findings that come out of that evaluation back to whatever stakeholders or organization, whoever maybe may need to be in the know of sort of, how that feedback's ultimately affecting learners. So that might just be, back to you as an internal design team. You have a way of communicating, but often I think that is communicated back up to the organization, or in some way there's a feedback loop, right? So that you can make changes to this is an iterative process. Obviously we're not building this out, but in sort of a real world scenario, these would get built, learners would work through them. You'd have some data that comes back via these evaluations and assessments. You'd understand whether or not, the solution was achieving what you had set out to achieve through your objectives. And if it is indication that you weren't, they're not succeeding, then you have to refine something somewhere, and often communicating that to the organization is helpful. So you have that communication channel to work through what needs to change, and so it's just what your strategy will be ultimately to convey that information. Doesn't have to be, there's maybe creative ways to get strategic about it, but it could also just be as simple as having a set communication plan via email. It can be that simple.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, I always say, and again, we can bring up, if you guys want to dive into specific examples within your project, we can. But just since I know others like to watch this, the answers are sort of broad, because it just depends on the project. But I think, keeping an eye on who and when that data or whatever comes of that evaluation should be shared, either internally with the learners or sort of more externally with other groups. But that's going to be dependent on each project a little bit. Any other thoughts? And again, we'll kind of stick on project 6 here for a bit, but if there's nothing else that comes up around evaluation, then we can certainly move away from that as well, and chat about anything else. Silence.
All right. Well, I'll jump. It's Rebecca.
This is
I'm
your
a little bit. I'm a little bit stuck on this week's assignment. I haven't had a chance yet to read the case study, but I've read the other materials, and I feel a little bit like I'm trying to come up with ways to do bad evaluations that I maybe wouldn't have thought of if I weren't trying.
Yeah.
If I'm reading it correctly, I need a push, please.
As far as the sort of the discussion, I mean, there is some material.
The discussion to come up with. Specific to our project.
I think.
I mean,
the hope in the sequencing, and let me know if this isn't helpful or not quite where you were headed, but the thought and hope is that we surface a lot of where evaluation and assessment can go wrong, to hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls. And I love, there's already mention of sort of just logical fallacies. Fallacies come up a lot. That's typically, areas where we run into problems where people really, you can be really well-intentioned and want to get useful feedback and data out of a solution, but often our own biases and other things get in the way of sort of an objective means of evaluating. So I hear you. There's sort of a catch-22 of like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that. Now I've got this seed of how to do it wrong.
Right.
But the hope and the intention is, let's talk through, how data can be collected very unethically, and this is why just the broader news of the day and some of the recent announcements in Twitter and things are at least relevant. It's not directly connected, but so it's the hope is to surface some of that, allow us to get a better grasp of like, am I making any of these mistakes as I think about evaluation that will either be unethical or just or just not as useful as it could be, or bias is a big piece of it. We often want our solutions to be successful. It's the best and worst thing about evaluation is we as designers want to build something that is ultimately useful. But as we start to build in evaluation strategies, and this will inevitably come, it's likely feedback that I'll provide, is that as we build our evaluation, in doing that and wanting it to be successful, we can often skew the results of how effective it is, just because it's self-gratifying, but that's not ultimately beneficial to the learner, and we're not actually changing behavior if that's the case. So that's That's the thought. Surface some of where it can go wrong
Okay.
in hopes that we'll avoid it when we actually start building it out next week.
Okay. And we can kind of make up our world in the design document, as in we can say, well, we've already gathered data on, you know, how much, you know, the sort of information we're getting now, so that we have something to compare it to later. So we can kind of create that as if it existed.
Yep. There will be.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. There's definitely, it depends. It's not always, there's not always that layer of hypothetical, but yeah, that's always an option. And that comes up quite a bit at this stage, is to have to pre-build some of it to know how you would react, or how you would ultimately build some of this out. So yeah, you definitely can do that.
Okay. I'll keep going if nobody else is going to talk. on the bigger solution, on the bigger design document, the final project, are we just basically importing, for example, the entire journey map that we did? You know, if it was 8 pages, that just goes into the final as 8 pages, or do we choose highlights, or how's that supposed to go?
Yeah. So this, and I'll likely, there'll be some more communication about this actually,
Okay.
as we move, but it's good to know, since everybody's thinking about that as you should be, sort of as we go. There's a few approaches. Often what I'll see is, certainly with things like the journey maps that may end up being longer in length, a thought and a strategy I like to suggest is to just really make use of appendix. So you could, you know, just sort of throw that to the end, make reference to it. I mean, it's still, you know, a critical part of your sort of earlier analysis and design work. So you can certainly make reference to it, but then just maybe have it exist as an appendix and refer to it. Or yeah, you may actually just sort of cut it down and have it. You know, we're not going to be the grade sort of in and that project sort of behind us as a subcomponent. So you can kind of take some liberty if you feel like, as a final product, it's going to feel better to you know, refine it or cut it down or reshape it. All of these pieces really, in going through this process in a very real scenario, you'd sort of constantly be tweaking a lot of these pieces anyway. You know, as you build out your evaluation plan, that might influence, you know, a few pieces of your storyboard, whatever. These things are all sort of interrelated in some ways. So you can take either approach. If you want to put the time in to refine a little bit and make it really feel cohesive within the document, you can do that. Or you can just sort of reference it and add it as an appendix as it is.
Okay.
Or you can have it, or it can be 8 pages within the document itself, like that. You know, that I would say that probably.
Yeah. So basically, you're not going to tell us what to do. We can do anything we want. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. But again, it's what fits and feels right within, you know, your own context.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Anything else? We can even go into any weekend plans, anything like that, if people just have something they're dying to share. But we are at about a half an hour, which with a smaller crew, I usually am happy to kind of keep it at 30 to 40 minutes. So if everybody feels okay about where they're at and there's nothing else, then we can also cut it. Going once.
Yeah, I'm good.
Going twice.
I'm good too. I got all my computer issues fixed, so I shouldn't have any issues.
That's so good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Others don't know, but and thanks, Courtney. I didn't see you pop on, but yeah.
Yeah. No worries.
Courtney's had an adventure this semester with other things going on.
Canvas.
Yeah. So that's good to hear. Just, yes, and stay in touch, obviously, as
okay.
I can't make sense of some of the things you're dealing with, so I'm happy.
Yeah. But I am a student. They found me in the system, so that's a first.
You're real. I'm like, we've talked. I've seen your face. Trust me.
All right, that's good. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
Will or Kelly or anyone else appreciate everybody being here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
It was helpful. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, have a good one.
All right. We'll sign off then. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.